Oh, hi there. uh, don't excuse me. I'm just showing off the fact that I have my very first Kamen Rider belt. Yeah, the other day I ordered the Kamen Rider build DX driver, and I love showing this thing off. And of course, this is a Kamen Rider build related video, so I couldn't help myself. This thing's great. But this is not a toy review. If it was, I would have, the actual camera on and you could see the thing. This is more of a discussion about the series itself. So when X-Aid ended, I put out a highly edited video essay talking about my feelings towards X-Aid. And I still want to do something like that with Build, but that's going to take a while because, as you can tell, ever since January, my computer broke. I did get a replacement computer, but it's nowhere near as powerful. It doesn't edit anywhere near as well. And so, of course, I shifted my format around to suit these, low edit videos that suit this new computer setup better. And I do want to return to the video essays, but that's going to have to wait until I get a better PC, hopefully by the end of this year, but maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. And so I still wanted to get a video about Kamen Rider Build, even though I can't really do a video essay yet. So let's just shoot the shit for a bit. Let's just talk and reminisce about Kamen Rider Build. First few minutes of this are going to be are going to not have any spoilers or anything. First few minutes of this, I'm going to talk about the show very kind of generally. And then I will say a spoiler warning, and then I will talk about the series as a whole. But Kamen Rider Build, I have this giant hunk of plastic that you could probably hear right now. That's kind of proof enough that I really, really liked Kamen Rider Build. How much? It might be my favorite. It might be my current favorite. Now, of course, it's only just finished. And so as time goes on, your opinions, and you think about it a lot, you might realize that it wasn't quite as good. It's still good, but, not quite as good as you remembered it being. And maybe that's the case, but again, that's the point of this video. This video is to kind of just talk about my current thoughts and feelings as the show ends, which it has done today. I'm recording this right after it finished. And as you will have noticed from the thumbnail, I drew the thumbnail a long, long time ago. I was going to do a video about the first handful of episodes of Build, hence why Cross Charge is there, because at the time Cross Charge was the newest power-up. But save time, just use that one now. I never ended up using it back then, so just use it now, save time. But yeah, no, I don't have any notes or anything, and I watched the build as it was airing and everything for the most part. So yeah, this is going to be kind of a rough video to kind of edit and talk around because there's a lot to talk about. But hey, general impressions, it might be my favorite, and hopefully this video will do a good job of describing why. I guess for the sake of how do you know? You've probably only seen Build. That's probably the only series you've even finished. So I guess you gotta go through and say which ones I finished. I finished the original Kamen Rider from 1971, as well as watching the reboot movies from 2005-ish. I've watched Amazon and Amazons, both of those two. I have watched O's. I have watched Zekros. Zekros was a movie, but I still count it. Everything Gaim onwards as well. And then Gaim, Drive, Ghost, X-Aid, and Build. I really love Build, and I feel like Build does a good job of combining all of my favorite elements of Kamen Rider whilst not sacrificing the quality on any of them. And I get it, Build is a flawed series, especially closer to the end, but in my opinion, none of those flaws really affected me that much. Kamen Rider Build is the newest finished series of the Kamen Rider franchise, Kamen Rider being one of Japan's biggest superhero franchises. It has a new series every year, and each series is around about 50 episodes long, unless you're called Decade, then it's not. Each series has a completely new cast. There's a new Kamen Rider, a new person that uses a belt to transform into a superhero, save the day, or more accurately, fight each other because they're selfish pricks. And Build is about scientist Kiryu Sento, who has amnesia, doesn't know who he is, but does happen to possess a belt that turns him into Kamen Rider Build, and he decides to use that to defeat these monsters called Smash and find out, who he is, as well as find out the secrets that lie behind the organization of Faust. That's what Build's premise is, and its premise allows for a lot of really interesting stuff because it allows for a mix of everything. It allows for some minor kind of Monster of the Week stuff. I mean, the Monster of the Week stuff doesn't get very much focus past the first few episodes. It has like political intrigue, it has mystery, it has a long-running story. None of the episodes feel wasted. There's like barely, like there's no filler. Like every episode feels very important to the plot. Everything's kind of tightly written, and that is the main thing that I would say that makes Build stand out. Because every tokusatsu show does have a lot of downtime. And downtime isn't bad. Downtime is actually very good. Build doesn't really have any of that. Build doesn't really have much downtime. Build is constantly going places at all times. It's always focused on getting from point A to point B, and I love this. That's what kind of makes it a bit of a divisive series, because on the whole, it isn't really that divisive of a series. You know, it's actually generally accepted to be a really good Kamen Rider series by most Kamen Rider fans. But every series does have their downsides, and most people feel that the downside for Kamen Rider Build particularly seems to be the lack of downtime, the lack of Monster of the Week stuff, the lack of further development and expanding upon certain things. And I personally disagree, because I don't think it needs that stuff. Because yes, there are certain aspects of the show that it doesn't fully flesh out, but I don't think that matters too much because of what the show is focused on. The show is focused on having this very specific and tight narrative, and everything around that doesn't really matter. And it does that part so well that it doesn't really matter. And when I say it doesn't have downtime, I obviously do still mean it does develop its characters and does have like good pacing. It's just fast, good pacing. And I can imagine, especially a new fan would be kind of taken by surprise at how fast the show goes. But unlike, for example, the recent Vanguard reboot, this goes fast while also developing its character and not settling on the most cliched and generic tropes imaginable. I mean, this is a Kamen Rider series, it does go with quite a few cliche tropes, but it at least uses them in an interesting way and does something new with them. As for the designer build is great. I really liked his design in my Build Reveal Analyzed video back when Build was first revealed. I really liked his design in that, but now I love it. It looks so cool. The visor thing with the eyes is great looking. It's just such a cool looking suit. I love the red and blue in his base form, and I'm like kind of looking over to look at my image of Build that I have in front of me. And like, I love how sleek his design is. It's really neat. It does look a lot like Double, but honestly, I like it more than Double's suit anyway. Because I've never been the biggest fan of Double's. Like, it's a cool idea, but I don't think Double executed it amazingly with its suit design. Not terribly either, but it's not my favorite. And I feel like Build kind of takes that sort of design and puts it in a direction I like a lot more. And all of the other costume designs look great too. I love the gimmick. I love the 4 bottles. As I have one right here. I'm holding the rabbit one in my hand. It's so satisfying to play with and shake and like twist the cap of. And like, yeah, the shaking gimmick is enough for me. I know a lot of people kind of frowned upon the 4 bottles because they're not quite as complex as the Gashats from X-Aid as a toy. And I can understand that, but the shaking of these things is so satisfying that I don't really care. And the build, the belt even, the belt is really cool. I really like the design of the build belt. The build driver, it's just the classy one, you know? And sure, we have had like really sleek and cool looking belts before, but especially considering this one comes right after the X-Aid one. And the X-Aid belt I love too, but I love the X-Aid one because it's gaudy. Because it embraces the bright colors and shit. Whereas with this one, I like how kind of classy and kind of mature this one is. I mean, it's still a dumb kid's toy, but in terms of how it's designed, it's really cool. I love the gears in it. I love how satisfying the crank is. It's a really, really well designed belt, and I love that it has the yellow belt part to it itself. And I remember liking it even when it was first revealed, and now that I have it in my hands physically, I like it even more. And of course, it goes without saying, with tokusatsu stuff like this, the designs of the suits and the belts and the toys and stuff are just as important as the story of the show, in my opinion. Of course, story is king, but a tokusatsu show having cool looking suits and cool looking belts and stuff like that is equal to an anime like Gurren Lagann having a really cool art style. It's the same thing to me. It all comes down to the aesthetics of the show in question. And with tokusatsu, in my opinion, the aesthetics is one of the biggest draws to the genre, just because it's a cool looking genre, in my opinion, anyway. And Build nails that, and we'll get into more specific detail with different suits a little bit. But yeah, no, that's Kamen Rider Build, and I absolutely recommend it. If you are interested in tokusatsu, if you're interested in Kamen Rider, if you're already a Kamen Rider fan that decided not to watch Build yet because you didn't want to watch a show as it's airing, and now that it's finished, you're like, okay, cool. Should I watch this show? Yes. I genuinely think you should. Like, at the very least, watch the first handful of episodes. I do know someone that watched the first episode and was like, this isn't my thing. Like, I do like old Kamen Rider series like Phase, but I watched the first episode of Build, and like the comedy was a bit too in your face and everything. And I'm like, fair enough. At least you gave it a shot, But other than that, pretty much every other Kamen Rider fan I know seems to at least like Build and accept it as entertaining. So, yes, if you have not seen Kamen Rider Build, then you should probably get out now and actually watch it, because now I'm going to kind of go into more detail. And I'm not going to go out my way to spoil things necessarily, but I am going to be discussing the show from this point on, And if discussing a certain aspect of the show requires me to, say a thing that happens in the show, you can kind of see where this is going. So basically, if you do get spoiled for something from this point onwards, yeah, not really my fault. But again, if you have no intention on watching the show, then you may as well stay, eh? So that's the spoilers officially on now. So yes, Kamen Rider Build is split into different story arcs, with the first one being around the mystery behind Sento's appearance and the organization known as Faust. Then is the second arc, which focuses on Hokuto and the Hokuto trio and Greece and the kind of conflict there. And then there's like a third, like fairly short arc centered around Rogue and like the Gear twins. It's definitely the weakest of the arcs. Then Build pretty much ends with one fairly big long arc focused on Kamen Rider Evol. So the first arc is great because it just starts with a mystery, and it's a very cliched mystery, I will admit, like at least the setup to it. The main character doesn't know who he is. And yes, that's a very cliched mystery, but the way they use it and the way they execute it is really well done. And the funny thing is, this aired and this started airing around about the same time, a few months after Vrains started airing, and Vrains had a similar plotline too, based around like amnesia and not knowing what this mysterious organization is. And so that could be seen as a problem. Like most of what we get in the first episode is fairly basic stuff, fairly basic comedy with some basic like exposition about Build and his amnesia and trying to figure out who he is and who this mysterious organization is. And yes, on the surface, I was a bit worried already. I was like, okay, where are we going? Are we going to kind of go through the same motions? And then in the second episode, we kind of focus on Banjo Ryuga a bit more, and we see his girlfriend die, and that becomes his main motivation from that point forward. His girlfriend was killed by Faust, and now he has, not only was he a convicted, framed criminal, but now his girlfriend has been killed. And this reminded me of the previous series X-Aid, where Bray at the beginning of the series, this isn't a spoiler for X-Aid, at the beginning of the series, we have a flashback that shows Brave's girlfriend also dying. And so I was kind of worried early on that because of this, Build was just going to regurgitate old plot points from previous series and stuff and not really do anything new with it. And to be fair, Kamen Rider Build it's definitely a Kamen Rider series, let's just put it that way. It does reuse a lot of old plot points, but it uses them in a way that I think works. And that's the thing, with a series that's going on for this long, and with a series every year for the most part, of course, it is going to get like this. It is going to get a bit repetitive, it's going to use old plot points. But I think that Build used everything in a way that still felt a little bit fresh and interesting. Not always. I didn't like, and this is one of the only things I didn't like about Build, I didn't like that we had a second tournament. So in the Hokuto arc with Greece and everything, we get a tournament. And those two parts of Japan agree, okay, we're going to have a tournament between Build and Greece, and whoever wins this like mandated fight will decide what happens with this kind of conflict within Japan. And I was like, okay, that's a really cool idea. I haven't seen that in Kamen Rider before. That's really interesting to kind of have like a boxing match of kind of types. It's not actually a boxing match, but something that's kind of organized as if it was. That's kind of cool. I like that. Then a few episodes later, they do it again with Kamen Rider Rogue. They just do the same thing again. I get that you have to keep the plot moving from an episode to episode basis, and they did keep it short, and it was well made, but it just kind of felt pointless because it didn't really add too much new. Like, the only real reason that existed was so that we could have the debut of Rabbit Rabbit Tank Tank, as well as the kind of outing of Sawa as a spy again. And that's another problem I had. Sawa's a cool character. I liked her a lot, but she was a repetitive character. She's a spy, and she kind of gets found out to be a spy like too many times, Early on, we do find out, oh, she's a spy. She's probably not actually one of the good guys. But then she redeems herself and is like, oh no, I want to keep working with you, Bill, and everything. And it's like, okay, cool. Then a few episodes later, it's like, no, I decided I want to keep being a spy. And she got outed as a spy again. And I was like, okay, we've been through this before. And the thing they do with it is kind of cool, where she kind of like double crosses them. And it turns out that her being a spy was actually a ploy so that she could help Sento. But it's still like, I don't know. It was interesting actually, no, it wasn't. That was the problem. It wasn't very interesting because we'd seen this before. And even if it hadn't been done before, it's still like, oh, a character who was a spy. Like, that was a cliffhanger. I was watching this, as I mentioned, as it was airing, which meant that every week's cliffhanger I kind of had to stick through. And so one of the plot points they'd like kind of set up was like, oh, one of the characters is actually not who they said they were. They're a spy or whatever. And like, it had like the unusual like suspects kind of like lineup of like all the main characters. And people were like speculating on like who it was. Like, oh, it's Grease. Oh, it's Banjo. Oh, it's whoever. It was just Sawa again for the second time. Like, okay. And I guess while we're at it, we should kind of talk about the other flaws with Build, because it is a flawed series, and those were two of the flaws. Another one of the flaws was I love Grease, and I love his character and everything, and I love how his character arc ended. But goddamn, the joke with him and Misora and him oogling over her because she was an idol went on too much. Like, at first I was like, okay, fair enough, not all of the comedy is going to be for me. For the most part, I did like Build's comedy, but this one specific joke, I was like, okay. And it just kind of kept dragging on, and it kept going with that joke, and they kept going with it, and they made like a waifu pillow, Dakimakura kind of thing with her on, and made a bunch of jokes about that. And yes, the jokes were sometimes funny, but it kept going. They need to know when to let a joke go. And speaking of Misora is one of my other complaints. Where she ties into the story later on in regards to Evolt and Banjo Ryuga was kind of neat, and I liked that. But that got like no screen time, and instead she was an idol, like comedy relief kind of character. Well, she was more of a straight man, but like they made her crazy yandere, and they were like, oh, if you wake her up, she'll break your legs, and whoa, she's so crazy. And she just kind of felt pointless. And the reason she was there was in the first arc so she could purify the 4 bottles, and in the Evo arc so she can give the exposition dump about who Banjo Ryuga really is and who she is. But after that point, she becomes pointless, and she's just kind of there. And between those 2 points, she's just kind of pointless and just kind of there. And it's a shame. And I'm not saying she should have been a writer or anything, like, because that would have just made it even more pointless, honestly, because we've already got a lot of writers in this series. But, she's just kind of there. And a similar thing goes for Utsumi. Utsumi did play a big role for most of the series. And I'm happy he did finally get turned into a writer with Kamen Rider Mad Rogue. But ironically enough, it was when he became Kamen Rider Mad Rogue that he just kind of became a pointless character. It just kind of hung around. Before that point, he was interesting because he was kind of deceiving, and like he didn't know really who he was siding with. And like in the really cool like web series thing, he kind of like helped out Sento, and that was neat. But he was just kind of there when he became Mad Rogue. When he finally got his dream of becoming a writer, he became like the least important writer ever. Another problem is the Gear Twins. The Gear Twins, I don't think this is an unpopular opinion, but they solely existed to be beat up. They were there for action scene fodder. They were there because we need an action scene in this episode. Okay, send out the Gear Twins and we can just have Banjo punch him for a bit. Yeah, they're not great characters. I mean, they didn't need to be, but they got too much screen time considering how small the role they played. If they were only in a couple episodes, then they could have been cool. But the fact that they were in such a large stretch of the show kind of made them pointless. And again, they were just kind of there to be punched. And another perceived problem, I don't think this one's a problem, but because of Evolt's, grand plan, and because of Soichi's grand plan in the grand scheme of things, that means that the first kind of half of the show consists of Bloodstalk giving Sento all of his power-ups and stuff. Yeah, this show had the problem of the villains kind of giving up too easy and being like, oh, here's a bunch of power-up. Like, the villains, in some cases, the villains ended up helping Sento and the others way more than his allies did. I like the way they explained it, and I quite liked how it was done, because even when it was happening, I was like, okay, I don't mind Bloodstalk giving Sento all of these power-ups and all this leeway and letting him get away with things, as long as the explanation for why is important and is one that makes sense. And the explanation for why, in my opinion, was good enough. And that was that they needed Banjo to be powerful enough and have a high enough hazard level so that they could open the Pandora's box and everything. And I was like, yeah, you know what, fine. It was one of those like, oh, everything that happened up to this point was my plan all along, similar to Aizen from Bleach, and I needed you to be this powerful, otherwise my plan wouldn't have worked. I'm fine with that. That's a good enough excuse. And again, I don't mind shows where occasionally like the villain will help out the protagonist as long as it's warranted. Like, because a lot of people have problems with that, where it's like, well, now the villain doesn't feel very threatening. Maybe. But I see it the other way around. I see it as, no, this actually kind of makes the villain a little bit more threatening because they're so cocky and overconfident that they do kind of help the villain with their own hubris. Kind of like a sort of Dio situation in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where he has like so much hubris that that's his downfall, Like, he's so overconfident that kind of ends up stabbing in the back, literally and figuratively. And so I don't mind that. And when viewed from that point of view, Soichi was a really good villain. And I really, really liked the kind of stretch of episodes with the debut of Rabbit Tank Sparkling, where we finally find out who Soichi is. Of course, the problem is it was too obvious. That part of the mystery was too obvious. For the most part, I really liked what they did with the mystery about Sento's real identity and who Banjo Ryuga really was and everything. That stuff was neat. But Soichi being Bloodstalk and having the kind of motivation that he did was predictable. I kind of guessed this from like the second episode, and then I think like the third or second episode ends with like the cliffhanger where Sento like finds out he has a piece of the Pandora's box, and he has like the line of like, oh, I wouldn't be a villain because no villain would be as handsome as me. And yeah, I got big major flashes of Dan Kuroto from X-Aid in my mind. And I was like, yeah, this guy's totally the main villain of the entire series, isn't he? And yeah, he was. And that part of the mystery was a bit too predictable. I mean, they literally kind of tell you it with the part in episode 2, I think it is, where like he kind of bends up like a tablet and then like uses it as a back scratcher, and it's like, okay, cool. So now we know that he is extremely powerful. But I did like the episodes where we actually kind of got like that came into its own. He fully separated from Sento finally, and was like, next time I see you, you will be my enemy 100%. That stuff was really cool. And I really liked that after that point, we kind of like spent a lot of time away from Bloodstalk as a major enemy. Like he just kind of played with strings behind the scenes and kind of, he was kind of the one that like helped convince Grease to fight Build, and kind of the one that convinced Rogue to fight Build. And I quite like that maniacal sort of villain. And again, that kind of plays into the whole, oh, I did this, like I was puppeteering everything this entire time so that Banjo Ryuga could get powerful. I really liked that, because then it meant that when Bloodstalk came back and became Evolt, it felt all the more like this was what we've been building up to this entire time. And I really liked it. He's a really good villain. Is he Kuroto Dan good? Maybe not, but he's definitely better than Masamune Dan. I can tell you that. Yeah, I really liked him as a villain. And that does kind of lead to another problem, and that's irrelevant power-ups. And yes, Kamen Rider does have irrelevant power-ups a lot. It has power-ups that they keep throwing power-ups at characters, and those power-ups either become irrelevant extremely quickly, or in Build's case, are always irrelevant. And that's a weird problem to have, because there are 60 best matches in the show, and best matches are kind of like the weakest form of power-ups, basically. I mean, there are trial forms that are technically weaker, but like before you get your Rabbit Tank Sparkling, before you get your Hazard Trigger, you have the best matches. And it got to the point where not only did we need a web series just to show these best matches in, after that it got to the point where we just didn't show a bunch of the best matches. We've got 60 best matches, all of them are toys that you can buy, but some of them just weren't in the show at all, and some of them weren't even in the small web series. Like, it's a weird problem to have. And sure, I know a lot of people would prefer a show that uses that kind of thing sparingly, and I think that they went a bit too overboard with it. I mean, X-Date and Ghost were pretty bad for that too, but it is a weird problem to have. At the very least, I'm glad they didn't force those best matches to get actual screen time in the show itself, because that would have been pretty bad if they just randomly forced them to use them. But yeah, and not even just the best matches. Rabbit Tank Sparkling, admittedly, one of the coolest toys in the entire show. It's a soda can that fizzes when you shake it, and then you activate it by pulling like the tab thing at the top. That's a really cool idea, and it's a really cool toy. But in the show, it just kind of exists. The power-up itself doesn't really have much value or importance, and it's not really communicated to us how much of a power-up this is, because in context, it just kind of seems just as powerful as Rabbit Tank, It just kind of seems as powerful as Build's base form, and so it just kind of existed to just sell the toy. And to be fair, with these kinds of shows, they do make the toys first. They design the toys first, and then they give them to the writer, which I learned that because Gen Urobuchi in an interview or whatever said that when he was told to write Kamen Rider Gaim, that they basically gave him like the suit and toy designs first, and he kind of had to write a story around them. And I just love the image of Gen Urobuchi, of all people, being given like a banana lancer and being told to write like a story out of that. Like, yeah, okay, I can write a story about this guy that transforms using a banana. Yeah, cool, I can do that. And so I guess that's more a problem with the toys, even though the toys are very well made. That's another thing. Later on in Build, we get to the point where we get a lot of repaints. Most recently, of course, with the Blizzard Knuckle, which is a repaint of the Magma Knuckle, as well as having the most pointless power-up in the entire show, in my opinion, Great Cross Z. It's a red repaint of Cross Z. Yep, what purpose does it serve? I mean, it has one cool scene where it kind of explains how Banjo got his powers back after a point, so that was neat. The Blizzard Knuckle I don't have as much of a problem with, because whilst the toy itself is a repaint, the suit is also a repaint in the kind of way that it's an amalgamation of different suits. So it doesn't have any original parts to it, but all of the parts are from different suits, which makes it look a little bit more original. And again, its significance in the story and the fact that Grease finally got a power up it's cool. And so I don't mind that. And I love the way they use dry ice during his transformation sequence. But yeah, so as you could tell, Build kind of has a bit of a problem with just kind of shoving power-ups in our face. And that's a Kamen Rider thing in general. You know, Kamen Rider maybe hasn't always had that, but in the past few years has definitely had that kind of thing where we've had a lot of power-ups and we keep getting shoved at us and they become irrelevant after a few episodes. Let's go from talking about the worst power-ups to talking about my favorite. I love the hazard trigger. The hazard trigger is great. So you know how everyone, right, that likes Spider-Man is like, I love the Black Suit Spider-Man arc, where Venom's symbiote takes over Spider-Man's suit, turns it black, and in turn makes Spider-Man a lot more powerful, but he loses control of that power. Well, they basically do that word for word in Build. But goddamn, the execution, I loved it. I really do. Not to mention the suit itself is really cool because it's like a more jagged, kind of rougher version of Build's base form, but entirely black apart from the eyes. If the eyes were grey or whatever, then I wouldn't like this form, but the fact that they kept the eyes like a really bright red and blue while keeping the rest of the suit black, I really liked it. That is such a cool form. And the way it's used in the show makes sense, because it's a power-up, because it does make him more powerful. In fact, I would like to believe it's his most powerful form ever, but he can't control it. And so there's a bit of give and take. And I like that this introduced the feeling of, do I actually want to transform? Do I actually want to use this power? Because a lot of the time in Kamen Rider series is when you get a new power up, it's like, okay, cool, I'm going to use this new power up and become stronger. But I love this extra dimension of, no, this power up has a major drawback too. And the episode where Sento uses the hazard trigger and accidentally kills someone with it, not defeat or like injure, no, he accidentally kills someone that he didn't mean to kill using it, was amazing. And that was one of the best episodes, if not the best episode of the entire show. Now, remember in my Vanguard video where, in my most recent episode review where I say, I don't mind darkness, but it has to be earned. They have to do something interesting with it. This was interesting. This was really dark, but it did something really cool with it. And it added more dimensions to everything. How every character reacted to it, and how it kind of, it made everyone question themselves. Because this was a new power-up that was just given to him by Bloodstalk, who was the main villain at that point. And he's like, okay, I guess I'll just take it then. And then he takes it and uses it, and it's so powerful that he accidentally kills someone that he wasn't meaning to kill. And this makes Sento question himself. Not only does he want to keep using the hazard trigger, but also does he just want to keep being Build? There's a long stretch in that episode where he's just like, I just won't even touch the belt anymore because I just can't do it anymore. And that was so interesting. And I really liked that. That was so cool. And that was my favorite part of the show in general. I really liked that part. Because again, it adds a new dimension to everything. Imagine if every Kamen Rider power-up was like that, or at least every major Kamen Rider power-up was like that, where it had some kind of really cool advantage, but also a massive drawback. And X8 kind of tried to do something like this with the Mighty Brothers Double X and Powad, but the hazard trigger just nails this kind of thing so well. And of course, in future, if they do more stuff like this, I hope it isn't the same drawback where it's like, oh, it's so powerful he physically can't control himself. But there are ways of doing similar things to this, and I love the idea where it's like, okay, Sento is smart. That's his thing, he's a scientist. And so now he actually has to use those brains to his advantage and choose which power-up's best for which situation. It's not like X8 or other series where it's like, I just use the most recent power-up because that's the most powerful one, you know? I'm just gonna use Hyper Muteki, because why the fuck would I not use Hyper Muteki? A lot of people seem to think that Banjo Ryuga is the best character in the show. And to an extent, I agree. I really, really like Banjo Ryuga, and I really like what they do with him, and I'm gonna talk about that in a sec. But I think what Build has done is really interesting. I really like shows where they have a protagonist, but if you follow the certain expected tropes, then a different character in the show should have been the protagonist. And that's what Build has done. Build has done that to a T. It has taken Banjo Yuga and Sento, and it switched their place. And I really like that. So basically, for those who don't understand, most Kamen Rider series on average, especially the more recent ones, seem to have a very kind of over-the-top, expressive, emotional, yet powerful main character protagonist. Someone similar to Takeru or Emu, you know? Someone who is really invested and kind of acts more like a child than the other characters, obviously, because this is a kids show and the kids need someone to kind of identify themselves as, you know? And later on, these characters usually end up having some kind of backstory or ability that is tied to the main villain. And that is a Kamen Rider staple. Usually the belt itself has an origin to do with the villain. Either it comes from the villain or it comes from the same person that was responsible for the creation of the villains, or something similar to that. Usually the belt has suspicious origins. And so a lot of the time, the main character in a Kamen Rider series will have a similar thing. They will have some kind of origin or ability tied to the main villain. And that's what Banjo Yuga has. He has origins very, very similar to Evolt's and the Evolt driver, that he's a part of Evolt. And so later on it turns out that he's part Martian and everything. And he uses this and he becomes powerful, and because of this his hazard level rises much faster than all the other characters. And everything about Banjo Yuga feels very protagonist. He's very explosive, he's very strong, he gains power faster than everyone else, and he gains a lot of power-ups. And so he feels like this like the main character, whereas Sento, in my opinion, feels more like the secondary rider. He's a bit more sarcastic, he's a bit more kind of subdued, he's smarter, and he's more technically proficient. Like, yes, Banjo's stronger, but Sento is more focused on technique, you know? Like, Banjo's brute force, but Sento is logic, you know? And so Sento's a better fighter, technically, because he knows more and is smarter, whereas Banjo brute forces it almost every single time. And so because of this, yeah, Sento feels like the secondary rider in the show, whereas Banjo feels like the protagonist. And in fact, Banjo does get a lot of screen time in the show. But I think that if you actually had Banjo as the protagonist and actually had Sento as the secondary rider who gets introduced a few episodes in, I think this show would suffer. I think what they did by switching their places like that was really interesting and clever. Because of this, we have a secondary rider, Banjo, who feels way more fleshed out and involved in the plot than most other secondary riders do. Because a lot of secondary riders, when they first appear, do seem important and everything, but then for the rest of the series, they're just kind of hanging out and doing whatever. Like Karen and Mark, and Drive even pokes fun at this by having this kind of ongoing story line about Mark being frustrated that he doesn't get any of the power-ups. And that was a fun little kind of story. But Banjo is constantly involved and constantly has everything on the line. In fact, he has nothing else to lose, really. And that makes for a secondary rider that feels way more fleshed out and involving. And because of that, he feels like a really good character, and he is. And of course, good writing has a lot to do with that. But this cool kind of switch of the status quo kind of helps too. And I think the same kind of applies to Sento. I think if Sento were a secondary rider, he'd feel a lot more predictable. But the fact that he is the main character kind of refreshes things in a way that's really interesting. It makes Build feel new without actually being the most new series in the world. And it's the combination of that and just the straight up good writing of the show that really kind of helps Build stand out. And I feel like a lot of that applies to the rest of the show as well, like with Evolt. Evolt is a villain that feels somewhat generic. You know, like he starts off as a good guy, but then it's revealed that he's the villain. And then it turns out he's like, oh, I want to destroy Earth so the Martians and, you know, whatever. And that seems fairly typical of this kind of show, but the way it's executed is done really well. And that's why Build is kind of a difficult show to talk about because it just is. It takes these kind of fairly been there, done that concepts and just executes them in a way that I found really entertaining to watch. Now, of course, that is subjective. You could be like, well, I don't find it entertaining to watch, and that's fair enough. But I did. It's a fun to watch show. It has a lot going on. And it constantly feels like things are going and things are moving and every episode's important and it never feels like your time's being wasted. And I really enjoy that personally because I think we need more series like that. I don't think every series should be like that, but I do think we should have more series and more Kamen Rider shows that do kind of have that kind of approach. Because even stuff like X-Aid kind of had because X-Aid kind of tried to do the same thing with a constantly ongoing plot, but even like X-Aid had a fairly slow start with introducing all the characters and stuff, but Build doesn't even really have that, because it has the first 2 episodes, and the first 2 episodes are kind of iffy, but by episode 3, we're fully in motion, and we're only going to get faster from that point on. Which is really cool, and it has like a lot of ongoing things. And of course, yes, there are a few elements here and there that should have been expanded upon a little bit more, but there aren't any like gaping plot holes that I can remember off the top of my head. It's just, it all works. It all is functional, and it knows exactly what to keep in and what to keep out. As well as having really entertaining fight scenes, cool CGI, like cool use of CGI at least, as well as cool use of practical effects. Like, it's just a good show. Like, people have complained like, oh, this is another series where the world is on the line, but because we don't have these Monster of the Week, like, character-focused episodes, it means that the show doesn't feel like the world is on the line. It feels like instead it's just this group of like 10 or so characters, and that's all the world is populated with. And to an extent, I can see that, but I don't mind because the 10 or so characters that we have are so well written and developed, and I care about all of them, that's good enough for me. Not every series has to kind of do that. And it's like, well, why is the world at stake then? Well, because it is. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing a bad job at defending Build here, but honestly, I don't feel like Build needs defending because it kind of defends itself with its own writing. It's just really that well done. Like, I do have flaws here and there, like comedy can be a bit overbearing here. The whole sour thing has been there, done that, and it does repeat a few plot points here and there. But even then, when it reuses plot points, it's done to still keep progressing the story. So those plot points might be done and a bit tired, but what's done over those plot points and what those plot points are used to do are still really interesting and fun. And that's what Kamen Rider Build is. It's just a fun show. It understands superhero shows. And that's another thing that I wanted to kind of tackle, because for most of the show, the characters are kind of selfish. And that's fine, and that's a Kamen Rider staple. Kamen Rider does usually have more kind of cynical and selfish heroes than most other superhero franchises, hence why we constantly get the Kamen Riders fighting each other. And that's fine, Sento is focused on finding out his identity and everything. Banjo wants to clear his name and avenge his girlfriend. Grease wants to avenge his friends as well, and Gentoku doesn't really know what he's doing, especially now that his dad is dead, But then we hit this beautiful point in the shows where Gentoku's dad has died, and we find out that not only is this a personal problem with Sento and the others, but it is a case of the world being on the line. And then this beautiful magic thing happens. And I just adore it so, so much. And that is a mentality arises. Banjo Ryuga kind of pens a new phrase. I fight for peace and love. And that, from that point onwards, that phrase, that motivation is thrown around a lot by each character. All of them say it. Sento after that says it, Gentoku after that point says it, and Kazumi also, I fight for peace and love. My motivation is peace and love. I strive for peace and love. And this may seem like a dumb, cheesy line, like whatever, this is whatever, and I imagine a lot of the detractors to Build won't have even paid any attention to this line. And maybe I am reading too much into it, but this is one of my favorite things about Build in general, and that is it captures what I want in superhero shows. I love superheroes, and my favorite superhero franchise is Kamen Rider. And a lot of people ask me, because I won't shut up about why I don't like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and those kinds of things. And I feel like those don't really capture the appeal of superheroes to me. Because they're just kind of mindless, like, Hollywood blockbuster films with a bunch of comedy and stuff in them. And they don't actually delve into exactly what it is that makes the superhero franchises such an appealing thing. You know, like, they do adapt comic books and stuff, and that's fine. But somewhere in the lines, they miss out the heart and soul that those superhero things have. And this is it. It's the fighting for peace and love thing. And you may be like, but really? Them just saying that they're fighting for peace and love is enough? But it's the specific wording. It's the specific 2 words they chose. It's not, I fight to save people, or I fight to protect my friends, or I fight to get rid of evil people. It's for peace and love. The sheer concept of peace and love. They like the concept of peace and love and there being no conflict so much that they just fight for the idea of there being peace and love. And not only does it mean the lack of a villain, but it means the presence of good. We don't want the world to be neutral. We don't want the world to be rid of the bad guys. We want the world to be rid of the bad guys and for love to exist. We want everyone to be happy. And it seems very kind of sappy. And it seems very kind of like, okay, it's a superhero show and they mentioned wanting to protect people, whatever. But up until this point, as I mentioned, they've all had selfish goals. And they're still like goals I sympathize with and I agree with, you know? Like if someone killed my girlfriend, I would totally turn into a Kamen Rider and beat people up. You know, like that's totally a thing that I would sympathize with. But the fact that after all has been said and done, and when they realize truly what's at stake, they realize that not only, like, that they aren't necessarily that important in the long run. Like, they've been very self-centered and being like, oh, Everett's attacking me. You know, I'm the one that has to do this. But instead, at this point, they decide to work together and fight for peace and love. And I don't know, it's difficult to describe. It's very difficult to describe and talk about. But there's just something about the wording, there's just something about the way it's said, there's something about how each of the characters individually pick up this phrase and start saying it themselves that just makes such a beautiful, like, part of each of their character arcs, individually too. And it makes sense for all of their characters too, especially Gentoku. Gentoku was a character I was very indifferent to during the first half of Build. But the second his dad dies and everything is thrown into question for him, that is when he became such an interesting character for me. And not just because he became a comic relief character after that point, but instead because he's like, fuck it, I have nothing else left, I'm just gonna start fighting for peace and love. There's just something about that I just love so, so, so much. Because in my opinion, the best series, the best shows, the best pieces of media, etc., don't just take what it does and you know, do it well. And that's what that's what Build does, you know. It takes what it wants to do and it executes it well. And that's great. But the best art forms, the best shows, the best games do that, but add something extra, add something special and personal and kind of sentimental to it as well, that no other show really quite does to that same effect. And to me, maybe you don't agree with it, but to me, I Fight for Peace and Love is exactly that. That is the special thing, in my opinion, that makes Build, that made Build go from, oh, that's a really good series, it might become, you know, like, I really like it, to this is my favorite series. That is what Build is. I just love it. There's just something about, and maybe no one else cares. Maybe everyone's like, oh, you're just looking too deep into it, similar to how people were when I made my Sonic Forces video. And yeah, that could be true. But there's just something about it that works extremely well, and I just love it. And yeah, that's Kamen Build. If you still haven't seen it, I strongly recommend you do. At least the first handful of episodes. It's such a good show. Like, even if you're not a Kamen Rider fan, it's such a good show.